Yeah, I meant cop out, not get out. Putting 3 is completely on the fence, isn't it? Okay-ish.
Okay, so let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on Mastering Sales Discovery in 2024. I'm Nicola, and I've been in marketing and tech companies for a very long time. And even though I've spent loads of time working on sales and marketing alignment, and I even taught it for 2.5 years, I realized I don't actually have a deep understanding about what it's like to work in sales, and certainly not how to nail a discovery call. But it's so key to driving a successful sales process and, of course, revenue. So I need to know more about this. Well, how better to do it than to bring together 3 absolute experts, and they've agreed to share their experience, tips and tricks on how to master this. So just a quick reminder for those of you who've just joined, please do introduce yourselves in chat and give yourselves a score on your discovery call ability, 1 being shocking and 5 being fabulous. So we're going to be chatting for about 40 minutes and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So do pop your questions in chat as we go. And we're going to start with some introductions. So Fabiola, let's start with you.
Thank you. I'm super excited to see some people that I know already joining. I've got a friend from school here that's also joined, which is really cool. So my name is Fabiola. Everybody calls me Fabi. You can do that as well. I am an enterprise account executive at GoCardless. We sell payment solutions for small, medium, and large enterprise businesses, specifically focused on bank payments. Been here for around 3 years, started selling to small businesses and now working with enterprise companies. And I started my career in tech sales about 5 years ago in a company called Attest, a market research platform where I met Mark. So yeah, super excited to be here, passionate about sales, passionate about questioning, discovery, building champions. So yeah, super excited to be here.
Thanks, Fabs. And I'm so sad we didn't cross over at GoCardless.
I know.
My time. Matthew, tell us about you.
Hey guys, good to meet you. Good to see some familiar faces as well. So Matthew Codd, ultimately, excuse me, spent the last 17 years in B2B SaaS. The last 10 of those have been a revenue leader. And I suppose 18 months ago, I set up a business called Cosmic Partners where we help organizations build repeatable sales motions. So this is a topic I'm really passionate about. So looking forward to sharing 17 years worth of grey hairs that I found along the way. So looking forward to it.
Thanks, Matthew. And Mark?
Yes, so I've also been in commercial sales for 17 years, same as Matthew, and I think we've probably got roughly the same amount of grey hairs, which is how you can peg the amount of time we've been doing this. And I started off actually not in SaaS sales and really didn't get a good instruction on how to do discovery. It wasn't even a thing in the type of sales that I was doing. Several years later, I entered the world of tech sales and learned what good discovery looks like. I moved into real commercial leadership as the chief revenue officer at Attest, which is where I met the wonderful Fabs, and she was our absolute star SDR, and it's been amazing to see her career flourish ever since. I was the chief revenue officer and operating officer at a business called Student Beans as well. And then more recently, having done some fractional and coaching and consulting work, I've founded a business called Revda, which is an AI sales acceleration platform. Really excited to be leading a business in this space where there's so much innovation taking place.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I think the average score we're seeing in chat is about 2.5 out of 5. For those of you who've just joined, please introduce yourselves and give yourself a rating on your discovery call ability. I am definitely a 1 being the worst, 5 being absolutely brilliant, like our 3 great panelists. So I think we need to give some help here. So we're going to get started with question number 1. You've all obviously nailed the discovery process, but I'm guessing you've learned from experience and plenty of mistakes. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What's your worst discovery call you've ever done? Fabs, let's start with you.
Straight into it, hey? I think there's one I'll never forget. That happened about 1.5 years ago. I was just transitioning from doing, I guess, what we call emerging or small business sales here at GoCardless to starting to work with some larger businesses in the mid-market space. And I did the same prep that I normally do. So I went on their website, checked out their checkout flow. We sell payment solutions, so that's normally what we do. Check LinkedIn a little bit. So I kind of just prepared like I was normally preparing for a small business conversation. And then I roped up into the call and started asking questions, which is the first thing I always do. And the prospect essentially came back to me, someone with a decent level of seniority said, I should be walking into the school to learn more about why you've got a unique point of view in my business, of your solution, and how, I guess, how your solution can fill into that sort of unique point of view that you've got and help us out. So I'm going to give you, again, the sort of the time back for you to go and prepare and get that information before we have this discussion, and so that we don't spend the first 10-15 minutes of the call doing that. For me, it was a bit shocking, right? Because I try to pride myself on putting the extra hard work and effort into doing, going the extra mile. And so, but it really taught me a great lesson that the time with prospects is precious, and how you decide to focus the call could really, really change the outcome of the beginning of a relationship. So, yeah, a bit of a.
Oh, I feel for you, just that moment. But also, I guess it really shows the difference of the work and prep you need to do for a call of that size with an enterprise business versus what you were doing before. Yeah, it sounds like we've got some people in the audience who've had similar experiences. Matthew, what about you?
So mine's not so much a call, but it's definitely ingrained in my head. But 13 years ago, I booked a face-to-face meeting in Manchester. I was based in London at the time, and 6-hour round trip, basically 300 quid. I had to justify the expenses to the CEO, only to get to the meeting to find that I'm meeting a really junior person, basically. And the person I was hoping to be meeting was dialing in. And obviously we didn't have good facilities like Google and Zoom and everything. So it's with a crappy like WebEx dial-in, basically. So it's not so much a call, but it's definitely taught me very early on to make sure that if you're going to book a meeting, qualify properly, make sure the right people are going to be there. So it's definitely one that sticks out to me as a big early learnings as part of my career, I suppose.
And that was 13 years ago, Matthew.
Unfortunately, yeah. So less grey hairs, much younger Matt with his suit and tie, thinking he's going to go and sell this big contract in Manchester, and came back really deflated, drowned from all the rain and everything, lugging my heavy laptop. So big learnings.
Oh, and Sid in your brain as well. Therapy required.
Exactly.
Mark, what about you? Was it also 13 years ago?
It was not quite 13 years ago, but it is definitely seared in the brain. So mine's actually a slightly different tack, which is when I was at a test, we just won our first customers, and we just hired our initial kind of sales team, and we got them to work running initial qualification discovery calls. We'd given them a checklist, and we were really actually using BANT to begin with before moving on to MEDPIC. And I came to listening to these calls, and oh god, they were bad. And what I realized was happening is these relatively junior sales reps, I hadn't clearly equipped them enough with the training that they needed, were simply running through this list of questions without remotely listening to the answers, without understanding the context of the answers they were given. And you could just hear this disengagement on the other end. And we were clearly just burning leads and burning relationships that could have turned into real clients. So that was a horrible moment for me, and really made me realize the danger of being overly prescriptive in what you're doing in terms of trying to give exact checklists without the enablement and the training to suffice. So yeah, haven't made that mistake since, but that was pretty horrible to listen to.
Oh gosh, avoid those checklists unless there's a real understanding of how to use them. But there's a nice comment from Alex saying used it at Treatwell, so clearly there was a good discovery call there. Well, Fabs, going back to what you were talking about that research and preparation, how much should you be doing before a discovery call, and how do you make this as efficient and as effective as possible, whilst, of course, ensuring that it's accurate? Nothing worse than incorrect research.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, love the exit tester user around in the audience. Really cool. In terms of preparation, so there are different levels of preparation required for, I guess, the level of the meeting that you're going to be having, and also the level of seniority of the person you're speaking to, and how close they are also to the problem. I think that's part of the research, is finding out who you're speaking to, and their what is around that individual that will potentially help you maximize the time you've got, at least on that first meeting, right? Because I think discovery is a whole process rather than just the first meeting. But in order to maximize the time, and I think we're going to share this around later. I have a bit of a checklist of things that I make sure I check before entering any of these conversations. We talk a lot about this also with my SDR team. We do a very similar thing for prospecting, but we check previous opportunities that they've had with your company, any other integrations that they've got into the ecosystem that you're essentially plugged in, having a bit of a read at their annual report, not in detail, but just picking out the key topics of the strategy of the business. Checking obviously Google News, their LinkedIn. LinkedIn is super important because it lets you see movers and shakers in the organization. And sometimes it can be trivial to ignore this part, but I think it's super important that you know who else is in that organization above your prospect, below your prospect, so that when you go into that conversation and going to start asking for introductions, you can have those names in mind instead of just going blind and asking for introductions to certain teams. Multiple other things. I don't want to overflow the call with sort of these tips, but hiring positions, their Trustpilot score, any connections, investors in common, industry knowledge. There's a lot. And I think the key to not, feel overwhelmed with an insane amount of information is to have a quick glance at each of these. So look at them from a high level perspective and start to form a bit of an opinion or a point of view over where you think your prospect is. Knowing your solution and knowing who else you've helped in the space, these information at least should give you a good starting point to start to develop that. So that's part of the preparation, I guess, like on the more research side that I do for discovery calls.
Great. Thank you so much. Matthew, what about you?
Well, for me, most deals, so I speak to a lot of founders as part of my job now, to be fair. So I've got like loads of data points here, but most deals, I don't know what the stat is, but based on what I see, I think the stages that I touch, I'd say like 90% of opportunities are won and lost in discovery. And there's always a big push on more opportunities, more basically. But doing more with what you've got is really important. So where I'm going with that is being really structured with the preparation, I think. So if we've got a meeting in the diary, putting that 30 minutes in the diary to prep before, putting the time after the meeting to do all the admin, the tidy up, make sure you've done the follow-ups, basically. It's also worth noting, I think, depending on the type of ACV that you're working on, it depends. It requires a different approach, right? I think lots of the opportunities that Fabio works on are like real enterprise opportunities. If you're working on like slightly more transactional deals, those 10, 15K opportunities, you need to be really lean with your time, right? So just having a very, very structured approach. So for me, the main things are blocking out the time to prepare for the discovery before, to do all that research, and how much research happened. It depends on the ACV, and then the time afterwards, I think. But the main takeaway for me, I think, is sometimes not doing too much prep, because I think you can go into the meeting with preconceptions as to what you might assume or what you might have read, but actually going in there a little bit kind of not knowing too much, it allows you to be really curious and ask a shitload of questions, basically, which is what enables you to really dig deep. So I think doing enough but not too much, so it allows you to stay curious on the call.
Great. So actually you can over prepare, and that's not necessarily a good use of your time either, depending on the ACV.
Exactly.
Great tips. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, what Fabs and Matthew have said really resonate. But just I guess to add a couple of different pointers on the pre-call research side of things. So one would be, have yourself a framework, and one good framework is to work backwards. So often a discovery call, you will be, certainly if it's mid-market to enterprise, more than likely using some qualification criteria like MEDDPICC, it could be spiced, etc. So think about, well, if I'm trying to understand these things, why don't I do a bit of pre-research and have some informed hypotheses ahead of time? So what do I think the implied pain will be for this type of customer? Who do I think the economic buyer may be? What do I think their decision criteria could be? And then you can use those hypotheses to then inform and structure the rest of the discussion. So if you work backwards from that, hopefully it means you don't over prepare and have to throw the kitchen sink at it. And then the second piece is, of course, AI should be your best friend now, right? That 30-minute block could potentially just be 5 or 10 minutes. The hour-and-a-half block could be reduced down to 15, 20 minutes. You can get AI to read the 10K and annual reports and give you the highlights that are relevant to your particular solution and buyer that you're going out to. You can help it think about structuring a high-level SWOT of that business within the industry. You can help it think about what is the likely point of view that they will have on the industry, what are the metrics that they're going to care about. You can use it as a sparring partner. So it should really accelerate that research and make it a lot more efficient without diminishing the quality.
Such a good tip, Mark. How much time do you reckon using AI can save you?
Enormous amounts. I mean, just enormous. Just think about having to read a whole 10K or annual report. They can be 100+ pages long. AI can do that in a minute or two and produce a summary. It's a massive saving.
How did we cope without it? Well, you've done all of your research. How do you then actually structure your call? And how does this differ depending on the ACV, as you mentioned, Matthew, the size of the organization, the number of people on the call? Mark, how would you do that?
So in terms of structuring, I like to try and keep it pretty simple. There's really 3 key parts to it. So the first part is really critical. That's the first 2 to 5 minutes. So I'm just admitting someone into the room. And that is really setting the tone. So the key things to establish within those first couple of minutes, up to 5 minutes, is that you are in the driving seat. And I see this as a mistake that a lot of more junior reps make, and they cede control to the buyer because they're worried about the power structure in that call. And so they say, essentially, I'm so delighted that we're able to, you're spending some time with me. What do you want to cover off? And they really let the other person dictate the agenda at that point and cede all of that power over. So it's really important that you set the tone, you set the agenda. And the second part of that is then calibrating expectations. So you can say, look, this is what I think we need to this is what we should be covering off. And you can still check in with them and say, does that make sense to you? Is there anything else I'm missing? So you're still being client friendly, but ultimately setting the tone. Once you've moved out of that, then you've got the main meat of the discovery call, and that's got to be a flow. It should not be an interrogation, a conversation, a back and forth where you are both gleaning insights from them, but also educating them and adding value and offering your perspective. You want to be an authority in this call. And then finally, you've got the wrap up. And you don't want to rush the wrap up and leave it to the last 30 seconds. So ideally, you want to have timed it really well. And in that wrap up, you want to make sure you are repeating back and summarizing and bridging, which is a key technique that I teach a lot. So summarize what's happened in the call, use it as a bridge to then talk about next steps, and then secure those next steps with a favorite acronym of mine, which is BAMFAM. So book a meeting from a meeting. And that's it. You wrap up, and then it's essential to follow up. But I think we're going to cover that off in another part of this webinar.
Oh, BAMFAM, I haven't heard that for a while. But I think that's a really good point there. Don't cede control to the prospect. You need to maintain ownership of that call. Perhaps anything you want to add?
Yeah, I love a good reference to BAMFAM. It's as good as gold, but it works every time. So I think just to tag on to that point, and the reason why I think it's important that you show that you're in control of the call is because sometimes the prospects aren't well educated enough on how to buy your solution and how to buy any solution in this space. So I think you're also giving yourself some level of authority at the beginning of the call to say, right, I understand your challenge even before walking into this. We're now going to explore that challenge, and then we're going to see essentially determine the next steps on the back of that. However you decide to structure that, I think it's important that you set the tone. But I think one of my key tips on this to not go on points that previously mentioned is that within the first 5 to 7 minutes, you should already have seen or perceived from some of the conversation you're having with your prospect what they really want to get out of the call. And I would try and make sure that whatever that is, you try and deliver to that objective in a way that suits your initial plan and the upfront contract that you're setting up, but also something that adds value to the prospect, because prospects hate getting on calls to then be dragged on to multiple other calls before they find out what they really want to find out. And I'm not talking specifically here. I think a lot of people might be thinking, well, if somebody's asking about pricing, should I give pricing straight away on the first call? No, none of that. I think what I'm referring to is try to dial into the most important things that they're looking to find out, and the things that link to their strategic objectives as quick as possible, because that is what's going to make you more likely to secure some strong next steps. So yeah, I can say a lot of things about discovery and structure, but I think that's probably one of the key points for me.
Thanks, Fabs. And you mentioned something previously when we were chatting about how you can really train yourself on this by listening to lots and lots of other calls.
Yeah, so if you've got access to, most sales companies today have access to some sort of call recording software. If you don't have access to it, I recommend you speak to your sales managers or sales enablement team to try and set that up for you. But you can learn a huge amount from listening to your own calls. And I think we're going to talk about it at a later stage. But we use a particular supplier called Gong here at GoCardless. And Gong actually now has a button that essentially you can click on and check whether the deal, based on your back and forth conversation, the amount of time you've been speaking versus the prospect, essentially gives you a bit of a score on whether you are going to be likely to close the deal or not, which again, it's debatable, but it does give you an indication of there is data behind well-run, successfully run discovery calls and the likelihood of the deal closing afterwards. So pay attention to those things, because I think there's something there.
So after your call, you could basically get a score as to whether they think you're going to close it.
Yeah, I think that the point, more than like paying attention to the score, is just like look at your metrics. How much are you speaking versus your prospects, and that kind of stuff versus the average.
I think I get addicted to that number. I have to be very careful of that button. So any tips or techniques to get prospects to really open up and get deeper insights from these calls? Like, how to avoid it sounding like an interrogation and actually being more of a conversation? Matthew, what's your feedback here?
I think there's so much you can do before the meeting itself to get on someone's radar, right? Whether it's that LinkedIn connection, starting a conversation on LinkedIn, or the email that you might send with the agenda. So just that little interaction that might happen before the meeting, so when you get there, it's not completely cold, and there's already a face to the name. I definitely think it's important. But the next thing I think is like setting a clear agenda. If there's a clear agenda, it doesn't feel like an interrogation, because they're almost, some are expecting a small interrogation, but then there's a clear series of things that they know are going to happen next, and that's their gateway to get to the next stage, the next level. Their next level is they might want to see a product, a demo, or they might want a proposal, and they know this is the kind of the piece in the middle. But fundamentally, in fact, I shared a LinkedIn post about this morning, actually. Fundamentally, I think it's important to sell to people and not to businesses. And it's really easy, if you're selling to, for example, GoCardless, to think we're selling to GoCardless and we're going to try and sell this really big opportunity. But no, we're selling to Fabi here. Like, what are the personal motivations for Fabi in that case? Like, what are her personal drivers? And then that takes it away from the interrogation, because it builds that partnership and collaboration with the person, and you're getting the buy-in with the person who's going to then help you do the selling internally. So I think if you deliver that value, if you build those human relationships, which is easier said than done, because sometimes people just go into full sell mode and start pitching away. The reality is you don't actually need to sell anything. You're just asking really curious questions, getting to know the person, getting to know what's important to that person, having that clear agenda, and the rest of it kind of falls into place, and just asking really curious questions in a non-threatening way, especially like the follow-on questions as well. So if someone said, that they're currently wasting X time doing that, asking them what they would be able to do with that time back, or what would be the implications if we could help them solve that, get that time back, basically. So as long as it's done in a non-scripty way, I think it's really effective personally. So hopefully there's a few little tips that you can take from there.
So actually, this isn't about sales. This is about asking great questions and building a human relationship. Thank you, Matthew. Fabs, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something quickly. I used to do this a lot when I was in small business sales, and I don't do it as much, but we did it a lot, Mark. I don't know if you remember. We used to role play our discovery calls quite a bit. And I think what that helps you with, especially if you're new in a company, is to start figuring out how the conversation can actually get scripted quite quickly, because it's like we all talked about non-scripted. And I think it can be really easy to go into that sort of like flow of saying questions. Whereas if you have practiced something over and over again, you're more likely to be a bit more natural when you say it after. It's like everything, right? It's like a sport. The more you practice it, the more natural it's going to come out. So yeah, I guess like for somebody joining a new company, I definitely recommend doing a few role plays if you're not doing that already.
Practice is everything. So Matthew, you talked about earlier how you follow up post call. And I think often do the discovery call and it's like, oh, done, right. And you actually forget about what you need to do next. So how should you follow up after a call?
Similar to what Fabi said earlier, it's a process, right? It's not just one conversation. So for me, I think it's important to show that you've listened, right? So definitely you've just asked someone potentially 30 minutes, however long the call was, a bunch of questions basically. You need to give back now to show that you've listened. So I think structuring a nice email that shows that you've actually listened. And what we're effectively trying to do in the follow-up is remove the friction from the buyer. As in a sales process, we've basically got a to-do list of things that we need to do. We can't just dump that onto our buyer, right? So we need to take that away from them and show that we've listened, but we're also taking note on the series of actions that might have happened from that call. And there might be some next steps that might have happened from the discovery, whether it's booked in a follow-up, a demo, whatever might have happened. But for me, I think it's really important to do that follow-up. And also, it's also a great opportunity to potentially bring other senior stakeholders in quite early. So if they said that Mark needs to be part of the decision process, that could be our opportunity after the meeting to connect with Mark on LinkedIn, to mention that we've met with his team or something like that. It's always easier to get it done right at the beginning of the process. And I personally think that's like a really cool and exciting time when everybody's excited to start kind of rallying up the troops potentially early on in the sales process.
Thank you. And obviously you've already BAM fam, so you've already got another meeting in too.
Yeah, exactly. Already. Yeah.
Not to use acronym again. It's just my least favorite one. And Mark, what would you like to add?
Yeah, so I think they're all amazing points. I think the only other couple of things I'd add. So one would be make sure you're adding additional value, and this is a great way to prove that you've been listening. So whatever topic you've been talking about, I'd really like to try and then add in a podcast or an article that I've read or something that is educational that relates back to one of their challenges. So it doesn't feel like the hard sell all the time, but it adds value and it shows that you've really understood and listened to their challenges. I think that's one key thing. A second piece would be, again, leverage, Fab's mentioned call recording software, leverage technology, leverage AI in order to reduce the amount of time it takes you to do that follow-up. So prior to call recording, prior to AI, often you'd have to make a decision around were you going to listen intently to a discovery call or try and take notes at the same time. Now you don't have to make that choice, but you need to make sure that you don't want to be wading through a 60-minute transcript, right? You want to be able to use AI to pull out the key points and structure it. And then on that, the third piece I would say is when you're structuring it, so this is a subtle or not so subtle plug for RevDup, but this is how we do it in this instance. We're creating a digital page or experience that structures that call in a really easy to follow way. And it's done in a way that's easy to access for other stakeholders, right? Because what you often do is you write just for that person, but it's missing the context that would make it easy for other stakeholders to get hold of that and understand what's going on in the deal. So whether you use something like RevDup or just an email, make sure you're structuring that follow-up in a way that's really easy for other stakeholders to be brought in and catch up and understand the context of what's gone on. Otherwise, they're going to fall behind and you're going to have to do even more catch up with them on a one-to-one basis.
Right, really good point. So don't just think about who you were talking to, think about broader stakeholders that are going to be brought into the conversation too. Babs, what are your thoughts?
All great points. I think I would just add the fact that I think a follow-up should tell how much you've understood the situation of where your prospect's at, and also have a very clear plan to action. I think that's probably one of the hardest things to articulate as a salesperson, because a lot of the times we don't really know exactly what's the best way to lead that conversation. You kind of have an indication based on previous conversations you've had, but you don't really know. But my tip on that would be to make a decision. I guess at the point where I'm at, I'm having conversations with larger companies. I tend to have a quick chat with my manager after I finish the discovery call to try and see if I've missed anything and discuss the call again and kind of see if there's anything from a process standpoint that I should probably be thinking about. If you are in high velocity sales where you don't have the opportunity to do that, or you don't necessarily want to do that, still have a chance to reflect on whether your plan of action is clearly reflecting the best way to go and continue down the process of buying your products, and reread it. I guess I'm not going to go on the point of the clear and concise, because it's been already said, but definitely make sure that when you reread your follow-up email, it's clear what needs to get done afterwards, and that anything that you can take out of the homework equation, because everybody will have to do some homework after a follow-up meeting, that you can do that. That will also help your prospects see, in the process of building champions, this is super important, because before you leverage a champion, you want to build a champion. And one of the ways in which you can build a champion is, as Mark said, send them something that's relevant about the industry, understand their own personal and their own personal objective to try and do what they're trying to achieve, like Matt said. So yeah, clear and concise, make sure you reread it back and that the plan of action is clear.
And create that champion by really adding value and making their job easy to sell you internally.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, it's been a tough environment over the last 12 to 18 months. What do you think's changing in the attitude of buyers in the last 6 to 12 months that's actually affecting how you approach discovery calls? Let's start with you, Matthew.
I'm definitely saying there's a lot more competition across all products and sectors and verticals, to be honest. SaaS has, the last few years there's been lots of investment, lots of opportunity, especially lots of AI products that are coming out more recently. So I think it's a much more saturated market for everybody. And this is the time where I think doing really effective discovery, building the relationships, everything that we're talking about today just becomes more and more important. That's how you really stand out, in my opinion, in a crowded market. That differentiating one product and one feature isn't always strong enough, right? So everything that we're talking about here. So, but yeah, definitely a key trend for me is I think just a lot more competition out there for everybody.
Right. So really thinking about how you can stand out.
Exactly.
Mark, what do you think's really changed?
So it depends who you're selling to, but as a broad statement, I think what's changed is people are far more hard-nosed, and everyone knows that pretty much any meaningful amount of budget is going to get scrutinized to hell by the finance team. And so you've got to use the discovery call as a way not to just get them excited about the features, the products, etc. You've got to be able to justify the cost and figure out, how do you build a defensible business case? How do you prove some kind of ROI through that investment? Otherwise, it's probably that even if your champion is excited about it, they're just going to know it's not worth their internal political capital to try and push this through, unless you can work with them to figure out how to prove some sort of business case. Is it going to affect their EBITDA and bottom line or top line in some meaningful way within a reasonable time frame? That's quite different, I think, than it was maybe a couple of years ago.
Right. So really arming your potential champion with the information they need to be able to get this through and to sell it into particularly like the CFOs and the finance directors.
Yeah.
Fabs, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think speak to the core strategy of the business. If you don't have a way to find that out from public information, then ask or speak about it on your discovery call. And I think our jobs as salespeople is to find the link between how our solution can help support those strategic objectives. Ultimately, nobody wants to be that person that rocks up and asks for money for something that is not justified. So you got to put yourself in the shoes of a champion as well. And when you're thinking about, nowadays, software used to be, depends on what software you sell and in what areas, but software used to be, the sale is changing every year, right? And there used to be way less stakeholders involved in buying software than there are today sometimes. So got to make sure that you understand that, and you understand the fact that your champion will have to defend you against other people, and then it needs to be a CFO defensible spend purchase, right? So I guess just on that, really speak to the strategic goals of the business, speak the language of the business. They don't really care about your solution. They care about what they can do with your solution. So always remember that. Yeah.
So we talk a lot about language market fit. So this is really important in the discovery call too. So you're making sure you're talking their language and really showing empathy and what they need to be able to push this forward. So one more question before we go into our quick fire round. What would be your number one tip for the audience to take away today? Fabs, let's start with you.
I guess key takeaway is, honestly, treat this like a sport. you're not going to get good at discovery calls the first day you join your new sales job. It's going to take a lot of trial and error. And I think we can all give tips and like endless, I guess, things that could help you be better. But if you don't go and grab these tips and try some of those things and see if it works for you, listen back to your calls, understand how much you've been speaking versus the prospect, does the conversation flow? Do you need to feel does your look and feel as a sales rep need to be a bit more natural? I think it's very difficult to get better without some feedback loops. So whether you're getting that feedback loop through your management team, sales enablement team, or yourself, I think it's super important that is there. And speak to people in the space. There's a lot of us in the community of software sales. Sometimes I think it's a very small community, but to be honest, it's a really big community. And so get yourself a lot of peers and make sure that you're leveraging what everybody else is doing. You're not alone on this, and don't see it as it's something that I'll never really be good at asking questions. Discovery is not about asking questions. It's about understanding a business and building a path forward to try and help them use your solution. So that's my key takeaway for people here.
Feedback and network. Mark, what about you?
So my one top tip is to really lean into curiosity. Be genuinely curious, and that means as a leader, you want to hire salespeople where you can select for the traits of curiosity. It's really important to bring the right people into the organization to start with to help drive good discovery calls overall. And as an individual, curiosity tends to mean you will go a bit deeper rather than broader on your questioning. So again, this goes back to this not treating it like a checklist or an interrogation. If you receive an answer from someone, if you're curious, you will tend to ask a little bit more, you will clarify it, you will dig a little bit deeper. And the best way to think about it is, if you can think about conversations you have with friends outside of work, everyone will have a friend who asks you how you are, and then they will move the question on as quickly as possible to something that they're interested in talking about, versus a friend who actually listens and then gets the best out of you. And you always know which friend you prefer to hang out with, right? So you want to be that friend that people want to hang out with.
Active listening.
Active listening.
Matthew?
Well, Mark stole a little bit of mine, so I'll give a little bit of a bonus one on top. My main takeaway was going to be around digging deeper. To be honest, like digging deeper than you think, and almost trying to break an opportunity early on to keep you paranoid, to make sure you've done the right thing. So a little bonus one on top, so it kind of crossed over to Mark, I suppose, is making sure that your sales process really aligns to the buying process. You might think you've done a discovery call, yep, tick, job done, moved on to the demo stage, and then done the demo, move on. You really need to make sure that the buying process is at the same level that you're at. You might have done your one discovery because that's what it says in the CRM, but they might have implemented a really junior team just to fish around a little bit, and they're only going to kick off their project once they've got a proposal potentially, and they know how much things cost. So a little bonus one for me is making sure that you really know the buying process, and make sure that your sales process really lines up to what that business has to do internally to before you move on to the next stage.
What a great bonus. Thank you, Matthew. Right, we're going to move on to the quick fire round, and you know the rules. No more than one sentence, please, if that. So, is outbound going to be extinct in the next couple of years? Mark?
Yes, in its current format of spray and pray, it is not working. It's going to be extinct.
Oh, I think that was just about one sentence. Matthew?
Yeah, I was going to say no, but I guess in the current format. So I think yeah, it still exists, but not again current format. So sorry, I've repeated, Mark. Sorry, I've definitely lied.
I'll let you go first next time.
I love this. I love the fact that I get to answer this and my SDRs on the call. So I think spray and pray definitely over. Well-informed, structure outbound. No, I don't think that's done.
And by the way, if you're listening and have an opinion, please put it into chat, because we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. And I'm seeing some very extended sentences here, guys. So should the discovery meeting be in person or virtual? Matthew?
I might be an old man here, but I like, where possible, I like an in-person meeting. I feel like you learn so much more. Like I can remember, I could probably rattle off over the years, 50 in-person meetings that I've had over the years. I can't remember like the Zoom calls that I had, potentially 6 months ago, off the top of my head, basically. But you just build different relationships. So it's a yes from
Not
me.
in Manchester, Matthew.
Not in Manchester, correct?
Not in Manchester. I'm trying to keep you to one sentence, everyone.
Sorry.
In person, and if you're not in person, move to in person when you can.
Mark?
I'm gonna go virtual because it's far more efficient, and only in person if it's big enough or well qualified enough.
Scripts or no scripts? Mark?
No scripts.
Matthew?
No scripts, but structure. So something to follow, a framework to follow.
Okay. Fabs?
I agree. Structure, but no script.
And no checklist from Mark's horror story. What's the number one mistake you see being made? Matthew?
In discovery.
Yes, sorry, to clarify, in discovery calls, number one mistake.
Selling way too early. Like, can't wait to sell what we do, how we help people, all of that stuff. So selling too early for me.
Mark?
I think this is a bit repetitive, but it is important. So the number one mistake is not asking good enough follow-up questions and going too broad rather than deep.
Okay. Fabs?
I'm going to go same as Mark. Second and third layer questions are probably the most important because they give you the real why behind why something's important. And that's really what you want to find out.
Right. So going that level deeper. What's your number one conversation starter, Fabs?
Well, I think you should try and relax the conversation as quick as possible. I'm not necessarily a fan to start with the weather. I feel like everybody starts with the weather, so it needs to be something different. I just always love to introduce myself and say, hi, I'm Fabiola, because that's my name, but everybody calls me Fabi. So immediately just putting a guard level down and hoping that the other person can recognize that and sort of relate a little bit to that as well on their side.
Mark?
So this is one that I'm going to credit to you, Nicola, because I see you do this very well. But I now try and start with a story of what's happened that day or that week that is just a bit personal. And that's largely because I'm really rubbish with UK geography and I don't watch football, which tend to be two of the very common icebreakers. So I found that works really well.
Thank you. Matthew, what about you?
Yeah, I don't have a generic one, to be fair. I do try and personalize it. I feel like there's going to be something you can find, whether it's a mutual connection or something. So I try and, again, it might be a stylistic thing here, but I try and make it a little bit personal where I can. I'm not a fan of the generic. I think it came up the weather and all of that stuff that you hear, right? So try and make it personal and relatable. It could be a community that you're both a part of, and you try and find some common ground or something like that. Just kind of softens the mood a little bit to get started.
Nice, something in common. Okay. What percentage of the time on a discovery call should you be listening versus selling? Matthew?
70 listening for me, 30 selling. 70% listening, 30% selling.
Okay, 70% listening. Mark?
I think it should be closer to 50-50 because you need to be adding as much value as you're taking away from it.
Okay. Fabs, which way are you going?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. 50-50 is what works for me. At least that's my data. That's what my data says so far.
Okay. And last question before we open up to the audience. What is your one recommended book or podcast for great sales learnings? Let's start with you, Fabs.
So when we chatted earlier, we spoke about a book called Jolt, which I would recommend to everyone. I think we can put the links later on, but it's a really good book to sort of frame, especially if you're in high velocity sales. It can be really helpful for you to sort of understand how to judge the indecision from a buyer, overcome objections as well. It's a good book. And recently, my friend Jack from Sales Love has started a podcast last year called No Big Deal. So I would recommend you to listen to that. I think it's a really fun, different way of doing a podcast. And it's just basically AEs from different, very, very different ACVs, types of companies, going through different challenges to sell significant value deals, and they just treat it as a no big deal. So I really like this sort of approach they've taken to it. So I recommend.
Nice. Matthew, what about you?
Personally, I quite like a lot of the content from Winning by Design, whether it's the books, the courses. I've been on a bunch of things that they do. So yeah, I'm a big fan. I really like the data-driven approach that they take to selling, to be honest. So yeah, gets my vote.
Okay. And Mark, what would be your recommendation?
So I second all of those recommendations, and for me, it would be I absolutely love The Qualified Sales Leader, which is a book by John McMahon, who's the guru or godfather of MedPick. That's particularly good for sales leaders. One that I'd also recommend for sales people is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. It's just so full of amazing tactical tips that you can use in discovery calls. And then another podcast that I really like is called Hunters and Unicorns, which is a really interesting series where they interview, CROs, CXOs of very successful SaaS businesses.
Great tips. Well, thank you so much. It gives us about 10 minutes to take any questions from the audience. So please do pop them in chat if you've got any burning things you want answered. And we have one here from Adriana. So what is your take on prep, discovery and closing next steps when you have juniors or the wrong department blocking access to the hierarchy or the right decision makers? So the meeting might be with someone relatively relevant or an influencer, so you don't want to lose the chance of talking to that company, but you're still getting blocked. Adriana, feel free to add anything and come off mute if that's helpful. But yeah, Fabs, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, so a couple of things that you can do depending it's quite situational, but the first thing that you can do is give them an indication over how other companies buy your software and what are the steps required, because that also will give you an opportunity to gauge whether they've got at least the intention to bring you at that level at some point. If there's no intention, then you need to default to the ability to either champion build, or first of all, that's the step of identifying if there is a potential champion there. And if that sort of fails, then you need to flag that in some sort of way to your prospect that you're going to, in order for this to go to a certain level, that's going to need to happen at some point if this is going to get real. Essentially, there's a really good book called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play, where there's a lot of talk about honesty and radical candor at some point where there's a lot of blockage in these areas. But the last thing I would say is also, if you are struggling to reach those levels, but you think you've got really good engagement with them and you don't want to break the relationship, is you can use your leadership or executive team to access their leadership. I've done it in the past, and I've seen a lot of success with, for example, asking our C-level or our MD or even my manager to reach out to somebody above my prospects level. You don't necessarily need to start very strongly, as in let's sit down and chat. It could be a very high level introductory email of saying, I know our companies are speaking, I'm very happy to help. And that creates a connection. So yeah, would recommend doing that.
That's a great one, Fabs. And VCs, if they know as well, they're the best at intros. Mark or Matthew, anything you want to add to that?
So yeah, two things interrelated. So one is you've got to qualify what the objection is, right? And this is where good questioning comes in. So if you think they're blocking, try and understand why, right? Dig into it a little bit. And the second piece is if they're not giving that away and it's just a hunch and they're not indicating that they're objectively trying to block you, then actually this is from Never Split the Difference. There's a really powerful technique called labeling. And what you do is you actually label the situation and you would say to them, hey, I get the sense that you're really not keen to introduce us to XYZ department. And by making that public, it stops becoming the elephant in the room and often diffuses the situation a little bit and allows you to have a really good discussion around why that may be. Now, you get two responses from that. Either they say, oh, no, actually, you're wrong, and then tell you why. Or they say, yeah, that's true. And then again, you can understand why. Either response is good because it starts to give you the opportunity to qualify the objection.
Love that labeling. So next question. What would be your advice to a sales team who has a great product that demonstrably adds value to end users, but isn't seen by the key decision makers as being a need to have product? So that sort of inertia. Matthew, any thoughts on that one?
You need to, when I say you need to make it, you need to have, like, when you're selling, right, you basically need to pin your value proposition to their business objectives, and then it becomes a need. Then it becomes a need to have. If you're selling, I don't know, an expense management solution, and you're talking about an expense management solution, it's like we've already got one. It's not a priority. It's not a need to have or whatever. But if within the wider business, the decision maker is that they're not able to reclaim, they're not currently able to reclaim enough VAT or whatever the thing might be, the current business objective. If you can pin your value proposition to that, suddenly your product becomes, it goes higher up the need to have, in my opinion. So in that case, if you haven't got access to the decision maker, it's a way of extracting that information from the team that you do have that you're selling, and finding a really cool way to present that back to the leadership team that really aligns to, you know, their 2-3 key business objectives, their OKRs, and that's when it becomes attractive. It's like your product doesn't actually matter to them. It's the things that you're going to underpin that, you know, you're going to solve a wider, bigger business challenge, I think.
Great. Mark or Fabs, anything you want to add?
So, sorry, I'll jump in really quickly, but just to build on Matthew's point, which I think is the core piece, you've got to implicate the pain, right? Which is, it's not enough to just uncover that there is a need for this, but you've really got to be able to articulate, just go back to building business cases, what happens specifically if they don't solve this particular problem. Because you can convince someone that they have a problem, but that doesn't always lead to behavioral change and action unless there's a real consequence attached to it. So that's the critical thing, and that's what like really great people in discovery do, is they needle down into not just as a problem, but what happens if that's not fixed? What are the implications? So that's how you then start to move it from a nice to have into a must have.
What's the consequences? So great question here about pricing. Have you ever had success in having the pricing discussion during the discovery call in a way that diffuses it as a possible objection later down the road?
It's a great point. I think this is going to be really, really dependent on what software you sell and your ACV. However, I do think that they're essentially pricing, as I understand it today, is a reflection of how much value you can add to somebody, to a company. So to be fair, at this point, after having gone through so many negotiation rounds with so many companies, I really see pricing as the amount somebody's willing to pay to solve a particular problem. So the main thing I would try and get out of that discovery call is, what is the value I can add to this prospect, and how much is that value? And unless you are selling a really fast, high velocity sales of a couple of £100 or maybe a couple of £1,000 ACV, I would recommend staying away from it, unless I guess there are some instances where you can sense that somebody is coming to you straight with a sort of RFP. I guess in my space, that can be quite common, as in some sort of RFP to complement some sort of existing project going on. In that case, you probably need to you need to trust your intuition over how to do it. But in general circumstances, I would say probably no. Stay away from talking about pricing, in my opinion.
Mark and Matthew, are you the same? Stay away from it?
To an extent, it's always relative, right? So I know people who will max out their credit cards to drive a very fast car that they can't afford, a very flash car, and equally people with plenty of money that could afford it who drive a very mundane car, let's put it, because they see no value in that. So their relative economic situations have no bearing on what they're buying, because it's what they perceive as value. So I think that's why what Fab says is so important to pricing. You've got to establish the value first. That being said, in this economic environment, if they absolutely flat out will not be able to afford what you're selling, and this is why the context is so important, no matter how much they aspire to have it, if they ain't going to be able to afford it, you want to qualify them out sooner rather than later. So talking about ranges or broad pricing concepts early on is okay. Just don't get pinned to an actual price, because until you've discovered the value, you don't want to get anchored to a very low price. Let's say every SaaS solution tends to have 3 or 4 pricing tiers. You don't want to get yourself anchored to the lowest pricing tier by having that too early before you've established the need and the value, when actually what they might need is the highest tier.
Great. Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question. How do you approach discovery calls as a very early stage startup looking to just get people through the door and using new tech? Mark, I know this is something that you've obviously got experience in. What's your tips there?
It does. So firstly, don't beat yourself up. Very early stage, you actually won't have a playbook. You are learning, you are optimizing for experience. You probably don't really have nailed down your ICP. So actually what I would optimize for is getting people's hands on the product and learning what does and doesn't gel. You know, do they actually use it? Do they not? And then using that to start to evolve and guide your discovery process. If, however, you find that none of that is sticking and people just aren't using the product, then I would relook and think about how do you qualify better at the discovery stage. And that is a bit of patience and a bit of discipline around it. So again, it's very contextual, but honestly, don't beat yourself up. When you really need to get good at this is when you start spending a ton of money on expensive account execs and you need to start hiring your playbook.
Matthew, anything you want to add there, as you've obviously got your own business too?
I think have lots of friendly conversations and don't sell anything. Might sound ridiculous, but like speak to people that you want to sell to and just basically ask them loads of questions. If I was selling to you, what would the process be? If you were to use a tool like this, you know, just loads of questions, even where they might be hanging out, where do those people you're selling to go to events or whatever, just setting up loads of almost like discovery calls that aren't discovery calls. And the great thing about them, to be honest, that they could become real prospects in, you know, afterwards anyway. So I think definitely set up loads of friendly conversations. You get a good data set. It also gives you cool stories where you can say to one prospect, oh, I spoke to another person the other day, they were struggling from, even if they're not clients, it doesn't matter, it gets you in the weeds really quickly. And people are always open to helping, right? So framing it as a, hey, I'm a founder, I'm setting up this business, or I've set up this business, can I grab 15 minutes just to get your direct feedback from you? I think is helpful. And the second thing is, I think just getting good at the basics of selling. There's some very high level things. If you get really good at selling, the basic selling, it does make you stronger. A founder that can sell at a basic level, in my opinion, is stronger than a founder that can't sell at all, basically.
Great tips. And I love that, having those friendly conversations and building up a story bank.
Yeah.
And on that note, with 1 minute to go, I just want to say a massive thank you to you all, Matthew, Mark, and Fabs. That was so insightful. I've learned a huge amount, although I still wouldn't rate myself as being any good at these. Maybe I'm 1.5 now after this. So big thank you. And we'll be sharing the recording as well. And I'm sure Mark will pop in some of the links as well that we talked about today, and especially Fabs' checklist, which was really thoughtful of you to put together. So have a wonderful afternoon. Obviously, I have to mention the weather. I'm sorry it's raining. And look forward to catching up soon.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for hosting, Nicola.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah.